Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome. I'm Merve Isfahani. I'm the Academic Programs Manager at Columbia Global Center in Istanbul. I'm delighted to host today's webinar in collaboration with Columbia Global Center in Amman as part of our Shifting Paradigm series, which looks at how global power structures are changing and what those shifts mean for stability, security, and cooperation. Energy sits at the heart of political power and post war recovery across the Middle East and North Africa. As conflict damages critical infrastructure and disrupts long standing alliances, energy systems are increasingly shaping both the drivers of instability and the pathways to reconstruction. Our conversation will examine how energy diplomacy, reconstruction finance, and geopolitical competition are defining recovery efforts amid uncertainty and strategic rivalry in the region. We will look at what new alignments and economic interest mean for the prospects of cooperative energy strategies, the role of states, and the risks posed by unresolved political disputes and ongoing insecurity. We are very fortunate to have an outstanding panel, great group of speakers with us today. Dr. Raad Al Qadri is an international strategy advisor concentrating on the nexus between geopolitics and energy markets. Drawing on 3 decades of experience, his work focuses on identifying the political, economic, and social trends that shape the evolution of energy market dynamics and public policy, and on evaluating the risk implications for governments and for corporations. He is a longtime advisor to government leaders and business executives globally, counseling them on policy design and public business strategy. Over the course of his career, Raad has held senior political risk management and energy market analysis roles at Eurasia Group, Boston Consulting Group. He also served as assistant private secretary to the UK Special Representative to Iraq from 2003 to 2004 and a senior political advisor to the UK ambassador to Iraq from 2006 to 2007, where he lies closely with coalition and Iraqi energy leaders on the development of the local oil and gas sector. Mark Ayub is an energy policy researcher and consultant, currently conducting his PhD at the University of Galway in Ireland. He is an associate fellow at the American University of Beirut Islam Fairs Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs, and a former non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. His work revolves around influencing policymaking through evidence based research with expertise on Lebanon and the MENA region. Belgin Şan Akça is professor and chair at the Department of International Relations at Koç University, specializing in international security, civil wars, state support for non state armed groups, terrorism, and Middle Eastern conflict dynamics. In addition to her well known work on rebel state relations and her book, States in Disguise Causes of State Support for Rebel Groups, which came out from Oxford University in 2016, her research increasingly engages with the security dimensions of energy politics, including how regional energy infrastructures, transit routes, and resource competition intersect with armed groups and state strategies. Her new book, Energy Resources and International Cooperation, Energy Security in an Insecure World, co-authored with Shuhnaz Yılmaz of Koç University, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Karen Young is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. She is the author of 2 books, Economic Statecraft on the Gulf States in 2022 and The Political Economy of Energy, Finance and Security in the Arab Emirates in 2014, as well as the editor of Energy Transitions of the Middle East and CGG, Hydrocarbon Economies, and the chapter contributor in the economy of Saudi Arabia in the 21st century. Her work has been supported by grants from Smith Richardson Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Fulbright Program, and the American Council of Learned Societies. And thank you all for joining us today. Just a quick note on the format. We will begin with a brief opening remarks from each speaker, followed by a moderated conversation. And then we will turn to the audience in the Q&A section. So please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box. And on this note, I would like to leave it to Adam Tooze, Catherine and Shelby Cullen Professor, Davis Professor of History, and the Chair of Committee on Global Thought and the Director of European Institute at Columbia University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merve. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me start by thanking our dear friends at the Istanbul and Amman Centers for their cooperation in putting together another fabulous panel in this series, which it's been my privilege to chair. We could hardly think, I think, of a more topical or urgent question, and one that is more important for the region that we're all interested in. In our pre-chat, Karen, if I may start with you, you outlined to me a really fascinating sort of historical overview of the development of issues of finance and energy as you see it over the last 15 years, really since the Arab Spring. And I was wondering whether you could start things off this morning, New York time, by laying out that development that I thought was an incredibly helpful way of thinking about our current moment and what makes it different, perhaps, from the world that we were in as recently as, well, 10 years ago.
Thank you, Adam. And it's great to be with all the speakers and the wonderful Columbia Global Centers. Thank you for hosting us. Yeah, I mean, the context, I think, is that, there is a universe of development finance, which has traditionally handled questions of energy infrastructure and infrastructure for basically industrial growth in low-income economies. And that's true in the Middle East. It's true all over the world. But there have been new actors that have sort of emerged with different motivations. And so my work really focuses on the Gulf states. And what we saw in the period of, say, 2011 to 2018 was a real interventionist model of development finance, but also investment and essentially financial intervention in states going through crisis. And, I term that economic statecraft using the traditional definition that David Baldwin and many others set out years ago, meaning that using economic tools to achieve foreign policy ends. So in some ways, that was about investment for growth, but in a lot of ways, it was about, positioning the recipient state's politics around the goals of the sending state. And in that period, the Gulf states used a lot of tools. They used central bank deposits, commitments of foreign direct investment. They used oil and gas in kind transfers. So, shipping a container of oil to kind of help a government within a balance of payments crisis pay for its energy needs. And in that, particularly 2011 to 2013, the amount of money that the Gulf states, particularly UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, put into the Middle East, North Africa, oil importing countries, rivaled or exceeded what the G7 or the international financial institutions were willing to input, either in the form of loans and grants or concessional finance for infrastructure energy development. So
Karen,
this kind of changed the deal.
The oil importing countries here, Egypt is pivotal, right? It's
Egypt was number one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Who are
Egypt
the other
received
recipients?
both.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we saw it across the region, even into Jordan, to Lebanon, but particular, Egypt was the largest recipient of Gulf financial intervention in that period. And then the tables turned, the motivations turned. We saw more of an inward focus, particularly from Saudi Arabia in terms of domestic economic development and a logic of return on investment. So really some disappointment in the amount of money that was transferred and put into industry, but also put into direct financial support like central bank deposits. And the Gulf states decided they should focus more on national development at home, but also to use their skills as energy giants to get across the energy system in as wide of a geography as they could. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why you see the development of state-owned or partially state-owned firms in the renewable sector, companies like Aqua Power or Masdar in the UAE, which are building out solar and wind power facilities all over emerging markets from Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, across the sub-Saharan Africa as well. And so this enables the Gulf states to continue to export and be in the oil business, interest in being in the gas business, including in the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean, and controlling access to what now is really important sources of electricity generation from renewables across the region. So, that logic changed based on concern for return on investment, a disappointment in some of the outcomes in the recipient states during the Arab Spring, and a mechanism to employ state-related and state-owned firms to make money, but also to be not just providers of capital, but to be firms that really are dominating the energy space, and that's across the energy sector. It's from traditional oil and gas to renewables. And it's also, I mean, we could add a whole other discussion in terms of connectivity and in data, and that's a new focus. But I think the takeaway is that the way states within the region think about their own interests, particularly in reconstruction environments or transition environments, has really changed. And so Saudi Arabia is now a net borrower, not a net lender, right? So their own kind of balance sheets have changed, and the way they think about intervention is very, very different than it was 15 years ago.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful. While we're sketching the chronological picture, can I just quickly follow up, Karen? How far did the oil price collapse of 2014, 15 play into this pivot that you're talking about? Because 2011 is like high times for oil producers. The world that we've been in since 14, 15 is a very different one, right?
That's exactly right. So by 2016, we see this major push in economic diversification goals and reform movements, within the Gulf states on economic issues. So, loosening restrictions on the mobility of foreign workers, a lot of external borrowing going on, the implementation eventually of the value-added tax in the GCC, and really kind of, an effort to attract capital and to grow these economies in the non-oil sectors. So yeah, that absolutely had a lot to do with it. In some of the disappointment and the willingness to deploy externally, and the world has changed because of it. By 2024, the kind of deals that we see happening, Egypt is a great case to study. Is more the Ras Al Hekma deal, one of the largest kind of injections of capital from into a developing economy, was a land deal, right? $35 billion land deal that the Emirates purchased in Egypt. But we're seeing new examples, and I know we're going to talk about Syria and Iraq and Yemen, which I think are very telling in the deployment of this kind of investment mechanism for energy infrastructure and dominance.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Rad, may I ask you to take us to the other side, if you like, of this balance? Karen's been speaking very much from the side of the powerhouse Gulf revenue generators. You have this extraordinary experience in Iraq. What are the kind of lessons that you feel that we learned there about reconstruction in general, perhaps, and the pivotal role that energy may or may not play in that process?
Thanks very much, Adam. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've had almost a quarter of a century now since Saddam Hussein's removal. And so it does offer a sort of, quite a long-term case study. I think there are four big takeaways, looking at Iraq over the past few years and sort of what you learn about rehabilitating an oil sector. One is that hope isn't a plan. And I think there's been a lot of hope and a dearth of planning. I think the process certainly takes longer than anyone anticipates. Um, I think thirdly, it's Iraq is a great example of how much it's about above ground risk. And conditions. It's not the natural resources. Having natural resources isn't enough to guarantee investment. And fourthly, I think that sort of policies and politics are everything. So, unpacking some of that. Oil was obviously, certainly central to the narrative of the Iraq War. It wasn't a war about oil. It wasn't an oil grab in the way that, say, the recent removal of Maduro in Venezuela was by the US. But, there was nonetheless the fact that the expectations in terms of investments, opportunities, and rehabilitation of the sector were huge. Pre-war, the Saddam Hussein government had laid out a plan for 6 million barrels a day, and that was seen as being, the target. And I think, there was also this sense, particularly in the US, amongst some of the policymakers, that oil would fund the wider reconstruction of Iraq and, would underpin the occupation. And the reality turned out to be very different. Oil production in Iraq didn't grow back to its 2001 level until 2010. So it took, almost a decade to get back up to 2.5 million barrels a day. And you didn't have the first opening to foreign investment in any major way until 2009, midway 2009. And when it did happen, I think the investments were something of a disappointment on both sides. I think from the Iraqi side that, there was a certain sort of hesitancy by IOCs to invest and to take up the opportunities. And from the IOCs, then this sense that Iraq was going to be a Klondike certainly didn't materialize, and the unpredictability that went with it. So I think, there are some important lessons, or three really big important lessons as you look to reconstruction elsewhere, and certainly as you look to the region with Syria, with Yemen, and sort of potentially sort of more globally to Venezuela and other places. There are three important lessons that can be derived. I mean, one is that you have to have effective planning. The second is that political stability is an imperative. And the third is that, governance, sort of brass tack issue like good governance, are actually crucially important to getting that investment in. Now, the planning probably gets most of the focus. US pre-planning for the Iraq War was dire, and I got to see it firsthand. But that doesn't mean, there were a huge number of studies done sort of just after the war and in the years immediately after the war. I always remember Thamar Ghorban, who was one of the first Iraq's first oil minister, and sort of who came in, and you'd go and visit him and he would have piles of studies in the cabinets in his office. And they all were flawed in much the same way. They were all based on ideal circumstances. They didn't take into account the real state of Iraqi infrastructure, the capabilities, deficit, in the Iraqi manpower, the established habits of a state-owned oil company, really the financing levels that would be needed, and crucially missed the fact that, you have to have an IOC, you have to have an international oil company appetite to go and invest. So Iraq was much more complicated than anyone imagined, and certainly than some of these studies imagined. And, we're still not at 6 million barrels a day. We're at 4.5 million barrels a day. Now, the second part of it was that none of the studies took into account political stability. I think, the issue, the plans didn't assume that you were going to have, former regime elements and then a civil war and then ISIS and a variety of other issues. And really, it's only been since 2017 that the security conditions have improved, and you've seen an improvement broadly in the economy since then. But those plans also, I think, skirted over some of the key political questions, and certainly some of the key power sharing issues to do with power sharing, issues to do with, relative mandate, divisions between Baghdad and the Kurds, regional governments. And so while you had a focus early on amongst the Americans, I think, in terms of trying to put in place a hydrocarbon law, et cetera, that delayed initial investment, you never really had the ability to solve some of the underlying political problems that were going to give the kind of clarity that investors wanted. And that still, dogs the KRG. And I think the final thing is, it goes to sort of a wider issue of governance. And it's, there is a lack of coordinated decision making, bureaucracy, corruption, all of those issues that dogged early plans are still there. And you have, I think that's partly a legacy of a state-run sector, partly a legacy of US downsizing the state, but crucially, and I think this again starts to go back to some of the political stability issues, it's about, political competition for access to resources. The groups still haven't moved together. Now, but Iraq is also, I think, the final point to take away in terms of the political economy of Iraq and some of the lessons is that, Iraq also suffers from a curse of plenty, in the sense that sort of oil is very much the dark matter that holds, what has become a kleptocratic state dominated by oligarchs together. It's the fabric of the system. So what it does is it produces enough finance for the state to run on, broadly speaking, certainly for operational costs. It eliminates the pressure for genuine reform as long as everybody's getting their share. And, it does provide political spoils for people to fight with. So I think, one of the challenges with Iraq is always going to be that using broad lessons, taking broad lessons away is difficult because Iraq has its own unique set of circumstances, its population size, its the heterogeneity of the population, the resource base that's there, and I think some of the origins of the current regime and how it was put together. But, nonetheless, it does show some of the political risks of rehabilitating oil sectors and how that feeds into the wider political economy in the sense that, in one sense, the over focus on oil, the fact that oil is so important is almost something that creates a dependency that doesn't incentivize growth. As long as there's enough oil and enough revenue, that incentive for sort of diversifying the economy, and even that incentive at times for sort of driving the reforms necessary to get greater investment in the oil sector don't take place. But I think crucially, and this is the final point, it undermines pressure for political and economic reform. So if there's one thing that stood in the way of Iraq becoming an effective democracy or even sort of representative government in the period over the last 25 years, it's the fact that oil was the focus, rehabilitating it was the focus. You needed the money. But the moment you had that money, it skewed the political development and the political economic development of the country and sort of very much facilitated where you've gotten to right now, which, as I say, is a state of oligarchs and kleptocracy.
Thank you, Rod. That's very helpful, a kind of dramatic demonstration of, at least in this particular case, perhaps not as a general rule, the issue of the resource course, essentially, and that sense of conflicts continuing because parties to the conflicts can maintain them on the basis of sort of disaggregated political economies is something that we've spoken about before, actually, in this series. It reminds me of a previous event that we did. Mark, the geographies you're interested in are perhaps not, this isn't their problem. One's tempted to say, or is that an outsider's misapprehension? I mean, an overabundance of oil is not perhaps either Lebanon or Syria's central issue. They're in a much more resource constrained position. At least that's how it appears from the outside.
Indeed, thank you, Adam, and thank you again for the Columbia Centers for this timely discussion. Well, let me start by saying yes, that there is a shifting landscape in the energy sector, in the regional energy sector these days, and if one really put things into perspective, 2025 has been remarkable in terms of the shifts that have been happening in the region, not only in the series of events or consecutive series of events that have been ongoing there, but in the speed at which these have been happening. And as you just said, Syria was during 2025, and I think will continue to be the field to watch in the years to come, and is becoming the key variable in this shifting landscape in particular. So the amount of changes that have been ongoing, some of which were unexpected or unimaginable over that speed. So I'm going to maybe focus on three main axes of those changes or shifting landscape of what happened in Syria during the past year and what we can expect maybe for the broader region. But this has started maybe a few months or around 5 months after the collapse of the Assad regime. And particularly the main trigger point was in May during the meeting of President Trump with Ahmed Shara in Saudi Arabia during the May visit to the region of President Trump, where there was a decision to start removing the sanctions on Syria. And I think that was the first trigger that allowed things to materialize or start. So just quickly after that, we started hearing, and I could spend hours talking about the announcements or the things that have been ongoing, but I'll try to focus on a few that are very important for this discussion. But we heard directly after that about ongoing discussions with the Qatari consortium. We heard about the UCC 7 billion announcement to restore the electricity sector and rehabilitate the transmission lines. We heard about 4 power plants as part, gas power plants as part of this announcement, and also around 1,000 megawatts of solar farm. Later, also during the summer, we heard about a UNDP or something that materialized, a UNDP, a Qatar-financed UNDP project of gas through Jordan, supplying Syria with around 400 megawatts for electricity supply. Then this was followed by a 900 megawatts from Azerbaijan through Turkey, Aleppo pipeline. So things have been ongoing very quickly at the geopolitical lens. Now, and this was triggered by the start of the removal of sanctions that were fully maybe at the end of the year in November, December, during the second visit of Ashtara were fully removed. The second change or the second component of that was the regain of control over the territory. And this is related a bit to the land. So one major bottleneck during the whole 2025 discussion was the US and even the the Gulf states were calling for one Syria, one army, and even one government. But more specifically, they were calling for a unified energy infrastructure when it comes to oil and gas, electricity. And the main bottleneck was the northeast part of the country, where 70% of the oil and gas resources were concentrated, particularly with the Kurdish forces or the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I think the SDF had an opportunity after the March 2025 agreement between the new Syrian administration and which was facilitated by the US, to really strike sort of a win-win deal, similar to the one that was signed later, for example, in the Iraqi case between the central government of Iraq and Kurdistan for the Shihan pipeline as well in September during the visit of Erdogan to the United States. But geopolitics didn't allow that to materialize for several reasons, and there was a lost opportunity then. So what we have seen recently in January, so the January 18 and the January 30th agreement between the SDF and the Syrian administration included full control of the Shara administration over all the oil and gas field. And I guess the SDF were looking for something that was more in terms of beneficial for them. But then geopolitics was very complicated in that sense. But this regain of control over territories has also allowed more announcements or investments to come into country. We've heard about agreement with UAE companies, Dana Gas, to discuss, for example, cooperation on onshore fields. We've heard recently, just in February, discussions that started in November when Ashara was in the US with Chevron for the exploration of oil and gas fields that materialized in a recent deal that was signed earlier this February, and it was also US facilitated. The third component, and this is maybe also to build on the Gulf states issue, was this return of heavy investments of Gulf states, not like triggered in reconstruction context. I mean, to complement what Karen was mentioning before in Egypt, today in Syria, the main trigger was economic and political influence to change the shift. Like previously, the intervention of Gulf states was particularly to like a counter influence some of the other influences existing, for example, Iran or Turkey to some extent. Today, they have a different approach in that, and they are investing heavily. We have heard about visits of Saudi officials and also announcement of like just this week announcement of for a solar farm between financed by Saudi Arabia. We've heard about another announcement from UAE-based Marv Energy of 700 megawatts of wind farm in Syria, etc. Just last week, this February. So there's a shift in the way the Gulf states intervene, and maybe commonality for all these three aspects or axes is energy infrastructure. So there is a rethinking in this reconstruction context of trade corridors, but also of energy infrastructure corridors, and how to connect those, looking at the fastest, at the countries that have existing infrastructure that need to be rehabilitated and expanded maybe, and the fastest trade routes to Gulf states and beyond it to Europe, etc. So maybe to just as a final point on that, and very quickly, there is moving or looking forward into that, there is this aspect of cooperation between all countries of the region that hasn't been there previously. And there was a sort of a myth that the Gulf, the oil and gas in this region is easy to extract, is to or cheap to produce, and this was never the case. I mean, if we really look at previous examples, it took Israel, for example, 9 years to move from exploration to production. Cyprus is currently in its 14th or 15th year, and it hasn't yet produced. Lebanon is still looking to attract investors and revive interest, etc. So unleashing the full wealth of the region will need in the future, let's say, a regional approach or coordinated approach in terms of connectivity. And this time, when we talk about connectivity, investing, let's say, in new pipelines like it was proposed in 2020, like the East Mediterranean gas pipeline, would not be something economically feasible. Countries are looking at existing pipelines, but something also beyond it, at electricity interconnections or connecting the, countries through grids rather than pipelines. So developing this intra-regional infrastructure, I think, will be key. And no one country alone, even with external financing, would be able to move forward alone and on its own gas without really thinking of the wider regional connectivity and to fill that vacuum of energy infrastructure that's currently existing. So the idea of collaboration, cooperation between countries in the future will be a central key for the reconstruction in such context.
Thank you so much, Mark. That really did provide a fascinating contrast to the angles that Karen and Rad were able to open up for us. Belgin, for a further dimension, in the pre-chat we were talking about your interest in Yemen, which represents another, in some ways, extreme and idiosyncratic case. It would be fascinating to get your views on the situation there and how energy geopolitics, energy infrastructure plays into a conflict which is, after all, by no means over there.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It is a pleasure to be a part of this discussion and learn from valuable colleagues. I think in parallel to what Rad was saying earlier, energy politics are no longer about resource ownership or resource endowments, as we very well realize. I mean, when we talk about energy politics, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, but in the broader world, we are talking about supply chains, maritime choke points, critical minerals, and infrastructure networks. And all of these, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, are deeply intertwined with conflict dynamics and political authority, particularly when the conflict involves competition over valuable resources among different local factions or military factions. I mean, in my broader research about rebel groups and their cooperation with states, what I find is more than 70% of oil-rich states end up providing some sort of funding to the local actors, which further makes the situation very difficult, particularly in the conflict scenarios. So, as Adam often emphasizes in his work on global economic transformations, energy systems, as we very well know, are not simply markets, right? They are broadly embedded in the political, financial, and security structures. So the way that I think about the role of energy geopolitics in post-conflict reconstruction in the Middle East, I think can be categorized under three headings. First, energy as a networked security, right? So we are talking about controlling the infrastructure, the access points to the global markets, maritime choke points, logistical systems, etc. For example, take Yemen. I mean, between 2023 and 2025, hundreds of ships in the Bab al-Mandeb choke point has been targeted by Houthis. Particularly the oil tanker, the Sow Union, was attacked while transiting oil near that choke point. The vessel was disabled and had to be evacuated under naval protection. So what is important here is that this was not simply an isolated maritime incident, obviously. It demonstrated that energy flows through this corridor remain vulnerable, and that disruption can occur not only in the regional level, but it can also disrupt the entire ecosystem of energy transformation. So once basically this kind of signal sent that the corridor remains vulnerable, what happens? Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes adjust, delays multiply, and energy prices react. So in other words, energy security is affected even if most tankers continue to move. So from a conflict perspective, this is what I would call an indirect conflict at sea, or a classic proxy strategy where the objective is not territorial control but systemic disruption. So the regional instability is no longer regionally contained. So the second topic that I want to think about the effect of energy on post-conflict reconstruction is this conflict investment paradox. We assume that investment precedes stability, or stability precedes investment. That is not necessarily the case all the time. So in many cases, investment actually precedes stability and then attempts to shape the political stability within the country. So in Yemen, we see how investment ambition and geopolitical risks collide. For example, when we heard about the UAE and Saudi rivalry, basically, which has major implication for reconstruction and governance. But we also know that UAE backed its investment decision later on because of the rising tensions in the country. So the broader point for this panel then, post-conflict reconstruction is not only about rebuilding after war, but it is also about intra-coalition competition, the agendas of the external actors who participate or who intervene in these conflicts, and they pursue different end games. So a similar story can be told about Sudan, for example, two different military factions fighting over the valuable minerals, critical minerals like gold, etc. We have again the proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and UAE influencing different sides of conflict in that country as well. So the third topic that I can talk about, again, similar to what Raad was saying earlier, the energy governance and how energy governance is destabilized by basically non-state armed groups or rebels, and they are shaping the energy geopolitics. So in several conflict zones, armed actors control infrastructure, transport corridors. I mean, in Sudan, we know that the Hamdan faction, RSF, is controlling some oil wells, for example, which is not something that we are not familiar with. So all of these issues complicates reconstruction because energy governance becomes fragmented due to the fragmented political authority within these countries. So I think I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Belgin. That was a fascinating kind of analytical framework that you offered. I mean, building up in the chat, and I can please encourage people to ask questions via the Q&A function. We have about half an hour, 25 minutes, half an hour to go. And coming to this topic as a relative outsider, I guess I had two things on my mind, and I would love to get reactions from the panelists. And one of them has been raised in a question on the side here. So one aspect that I really have on my mind is the question of the energy transition broadly understood. So I mean, Mark, you spoke about this. Karen, you touched on it as well. The global push to electrification as one of the dominant themes in energy over the coming decades, how that is playing out in the region. And with that, of course, there is the question of China, which is the supplier of so much of the kit. Notably, I understand also in the Gulf, which is sort of upending the assumptions that one has to choose between electrostates and petrostates and doing both vigorously on quite a dramatic scale. But perhaps before we go there, we can talk about the other issue, which is sort of headline news and has been raised in the bracket. Belgin, you touched on it, which is Iran. I mean, how do you see Iran playing into the picture of energy, conflict, reconstruction, political economy that we've been talking about so far? Obviously, key to the dynamics in Iraq, but also very much on the mind of the Gulf. Somebody in the chat, in the Q&A, has said, the kind of classic scenario of the Straits of Hormuz, to pick up one of those choke point ideas, Belgin, that you had. Who would like to take up the Iran issue? Raj, you're
Yeah,
first.
I'm happy to sort of give it a look. Iran is one of those. It's central in terms of it's a critical sort of cog in terms of OPEC dynamics and in terms of global supplies of energy. So it has an impact on the region, not just in terms of competition for investment, etc., potentially, but also, the region's ability to manage markets, particularly short-term management of markets, and has a key fiscal implication, sort of first and second order, in terms of what Iranian production could do in terms of oil prices. So to sort of sound a little less confused in terms of that, it's a matter of potential. So I think, the question on Iran is, where does the current conflict lead us in the short term in terms of a resolution? And what does that then mean for the opportunity set in Iran, crucially Iran's ability to export its production, its oil and gas, and to get investment to increase that investment. So it stands sort of almost like Iraq did, sort of, again, quarter of a century ago, as a country of great potential that, is at this moment in time limited by international sanctions and by a limited access to market and limited access to finances. If you had a change, and that doesn't necessarily mean regime change, if you had a change in the circumstances of those sanctions, then I think Iran starts to look like a very good opportunity for international oil companies, but given all of the conditions that I mentioned. So you have to have the right contracts, you have to have the right investment incentives, you have to have clear political stability, you have to know what your operating environment is going to be. And, for oil companies, this is a matter of looking out 25 years. It's not a matter of looking out 2 or 3. So, if the past is prologue in terms of any of this, Iran has gone through 2 periods since the revolution where it has opened up to foreign investment in the mid 1990s and just after the JCPOA was signed. In both cases, there was appetite from companies to go in, and what they ran into was problems in terms of contracts, in terms of returns, in terms of what the Iranians were willing to give these companies. So you have to look at it from both those perspectives. It's, what are the conditions that allow investment, and then what are the conditions for that investment, once you've opened up the bottleneck. But Iran, and it goes back to your energy transitions question as well. I mean, Iran would be, I think, a very, it is potentially a massive producer that is stymied by politics. If you get that politics right, Iran can meet its potential, but that is probably going to take a long, long time if Iraq or various other countries are any example from the past.
Karen, you immediately unmuted, and then I see your hand, Belgian.
Rod beat me to the punch. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more in terms of the dynamics of the current conflict and where we are, and this since 2023 and the start of the war between Israel and Hamas. Iran has been part of this conflict, and it has not been an energy target conflict, but that could change. And I think the way that the Gulf states have been at the fringes of this and had tremendous anxiety about it is because of the experience in 2019 when the Abqaiq and Krais Aramco facilities were targeted. They don't want to see a repeat of that. Since the exchange or volleys of attacks between Israel and the U.S. and Iran, we saw one attack on the Haifa refinery, but this could change very quickly. So I think actually in potential scenarios, it's the U.S. providing more of a blockade of Iranian export and transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and perhaps interdiction on the other side. And the other potential target is within domestic energy infrastructure, including electricity generation. So I would be very concerned about potential attacks on Iranian gas transit for electricity generation inside the country, because that will be a pressure point on the government. It will make people's lives very much more difficult, and that is in the interest of Israel for sure, and perhaps even the United States. If we get into that kind of cycle of retaliations, then all kinds of energy infrastructure in the region becomes at risk. And it has not, to this point, since 2023, really been so. So we're talking about certainly the export and transit on water of both oil and gas, but also particularly electricity generation, across the region, water desalination, all the things that really can be destabilizing, debilitating for domestic economies. So that is something that the Gulf oil and gas exporters are worried about. It's something that we should be very concerned about in the Levant, in Israel, and potentially what, if Iran were to retaliate on Israeli gas export and production, that hurts Egypt, that hurts Jordan, that hurts Syria now. The gas that's going to Syria is Israeli gas through the Arab pipeline, right? So you get potentially a very dangerous set of scenarios if energy infrastructure becomes legitimate targets of our kind of current conflict cycle.
Thank you, Karen, for taking us to a very dark place, which wouldn't be so much reconstruction as kind of ongoing destruction. 2023 is now coming insistently into the conversation over and over again, and we have a question in the Q&A about Gaza and Gaza as a reconstruction issue, and I would invite anyone on the panel who wants to jump in on that to pick that up before we slowly shift. Belgin, you wanted to come in on the issue of Iran.
I'm just going to be very brief. I mean, in the issue, particularly in the context of Yemen, Iran is able to control, basically, besides Hormuz, able to control the Red Sea passageway through its support of Houthis. So I'm not sure if a resolved conflict and stability in Yemen would really serve its interests. So Iran definitely has stakes in the continuation and prolongation of that conflict. But also in the broader regional balance of power, it is a reflection of Saudi-Iran rivalry, which has been, I mean, we heard sometimes that China is trying to broker some sort of a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I don't know how true is that, but we are hearing this from time to time. So it is definitely a reflection of the proxy competition between these two powers, which are trying to control the diverse spheres of influence in the region. But I want to shift gears and I want to go back to the question about China. With China, I think we know that they've invested a lot in renewables. And we also know that they control more than like 90% of the critical minerals on Earth. And this is not an amount that, I mean, I heard once one of the experts on this topic say that even if advanced economies of the world started working on acquiring these critical minerals, it will take them 20 years to catch up only to like 75% of what China has. So definitely China has leverage in these renewables and in this new form of energy that we are talking about, and it will definitely influence the future of not only the region but the entire global competition.
Thank you, Belgin, for making that segue. Mark, in your comments earlier on, I heard strong echoes of questions about networks, electricity grids as being a new key dimension of the geopolitics of energy and just the geopolitics of infrastructure in the region. I thought that was very striking to listen to you describe this rush of new power plant projects with this balancing between gas on the one side and solar and wind on the other. Can you tie up for us these connections between the reconstruction issues in Syria? Presumably Lebanon has an ongoing crisis in its electricity system. Whenever I look at its economics, that seems to be an absolutely critical issue.
Exactly. So yeah, just maybe quickly on that. The issue is that when, like, before the start, before the collapse of the regime in Syria and all the complexities that surrounded that, most of the region countries, including the collapse that happened in Lebanon and that's still ongoing, these investments in power plants, gas power plants, or even solar farms or even wind farms need to attract investments that weren't there. And first thing there was mentioned as any is first that who is gonna pay back the price of that electricity. And this is where during those years of the crisis, I think there was an increasing, and there's still an increasing interest about those interconnections because of existing infrastructure. Like the Arab gas pipeline was there since 2008. There are existing interconnections that some of which were unoperational for the past decade or so between Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and that could extend as well to Turkey. So after the collapse of the Assad regime and this shift in the landscape, and then the Turkish renewed also interest in Syria through different aspects, is also coming back from that. So the Mediterranean countries are discussing a lot of opportunities on that sense in terms of electricity interconnections. There was a question also, or some notes on the Jordanian case, and I guess this is also a very important case to think of, because Jordan has some of the most important, renewable energy penetration in its energy mix, and it's starting to think of connecting to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, but also it has some already connections with Lebanon and Syria. Now the question is about how to make those projects viable and make them attractive for investors. And this is still one major bottleneck. Second is are the grids. And when we speak about Syria or even Lebanon, the grids are very, in a very weak position, that they are not maybe stable or sustainable to integrate such renewable energy amounts, or even the base load amounts there, to transport them without losses. So huge discussions and investments are needed to rehabilitate the existing grids and connections between those countries. Lebanon has already signed in 2022 an agreement to get electricity from Jordan, but this was when also sanctions were there. There was the Caesar Act there. So things couldn't materialize even with World Bank financing. Currently, the costs are still very high if we want to revive that context. And there are tripartite meetings currently between Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, again, to rediscuss and renegotiate that. So I think this is the fastest way to alleviate the challenges that are faced in communities and citizens because they lack electricity. Lebanon lacks a lot of supply. Syria, that's the same case. And I guess also now, if we think of what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza as well, and the need for this energy. So this is to use the existing infrastructure is the fastest way of transporting energy. Now the question is about technical capacity, security of those, to make sure that those grids are safely, no security concerns are there, but also to make them financially viable in terms of financing.
Mark, in the renewable energy, or to the whole panel, in fact, in the renewable energy community worldwide, the talk is all of Pakistan, because Pakistan is this instance of two conflicting models of electrification: the 2010s model under One Belt, One Road of expensive, capital-intensive LNG-based generation, which was backed by China. And then there is the drama of what happened in Pakistan in 2024, 2025, which is the decentralized huge surge in 16, 17 gigawatts in a single year of distributed solar to Pakistani businesses, the upper middle class, anyone that could afford a combination of modules and a battery rig up. And both are in their own ways progressive development kind of models, but they're in conflict with each other because the more, when you're adding 17 gigawatts of distributed to a system, it blows out the economics of the grid. And you end up then with this conflict between two different models of Chinese electrification in Pakistan. Pakistan, obviously, very much part of the region that we're talking about in an extended sense, not, from this is part of the same conversation, key ally of the Saudis now around nuclear. Is there a conversation about the dilemmas of this kind of electrification trade-off? Because one would think for Lebanon and Syria, the simple answer is, 10 gigawatts of distributed solar with cheap batteries as backup just to get the economies going again. And then we look 5 years from now what the right optimal strategies look like for industrialization for grids or whatever. But in the short run, surely this is just bonanza time that the Chinese are practically giving away the panels. Why would anyone hesitate? Why aren't you just rushing towards a decentralized quick fix? Karen, I know you've been thinking about some of the strategic issues as well, so I'd love to get your view, because obviously in the UAE we're doing these incredible high-end experiments with 24/7 solar, massive battery backup, also very futuristic. But maybe Mark on the immediate situation and where that's going.
No, and that's very timely, and thanks for raising that. So very quickly, if we want to really move that model you spoke or touch upon into the region, I think that's the current discussion that's happening, especially in reconstruction context, and maybe in Syria and Lebanon more than others. But maybe anecdotally, but one of the positive things of the crises, or the several consecutive crises that happened in Lebanon and even the post-war in Syria, is people have realized the importance of renewable energy that wasn't really competitive before the war or before the crisis because of the immense subsidies, because of the cheap prices of commodities, etc. So the rush the absence of central supply and the absence of any alternative supply has led people to think of we need a solution, we need electricity, and this is where the decentralization is moving very swiftly in those contexts. I think and I believe any context of energy planning in the future, particularly in Lebanon and Syria, cannot really overcome or just put aside this what has been ongoing. We have in Lebanon today around 1.2 gigawatts. I mean, those are maybe not official numbers, but the latest estimates 1.2 gigawatts of distributed, which is around, I mean, 30 to 40% of the nationwide need. But the question is what, like a lot, and also there are no amounts or estimates about how much electricity is being lost, especially in summer times and in peak radiation times from those systems, because once the batteries are charged and people are not using them, there's a lot of lost energy there that are not integrated back into the grid. So we come again to the issue of any sort of energy planning. We'll need to consider those, and we'll need to consider putting back this amount of energy into the grid and benefiting, and then asking the other key question, how much central energy we would need in that sense, because we don't need heavy investments maybe in power plants if we can do and the region overall in terms of reconstruction, be it Syria, be it Lebanon, or even now Gaza, they have a huge potential in terms of solar energy and solar irradiation that they can benefit from. And we cannot think of any energy mix in these times when we see prices like 2-3 cents and 1 cent in the Gulf region. We cannot think, and storage have made a breakthrough as well, that we rarely can think now of a solar or wind farm without considering it plus storage in terms of pricing.
Yeah.
So that's a key and very timely discussion to have also at the energy policy planning.
Karen, I would be really keen to hear from you about what you see happening there, because both in the Emirates and in Saudi, there are big ambitions, aren't there, for renewable electrification, and obviously open doors to Beijing, very, very good relations, and well nigh ideal conditions in terms of insulation. And that is just like, anyway, power for free.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen this tremendous build out of solar power in the GCC with Chinese supply chains and China as a co-investor, and in some places a co-owner. I mean, the China Silk Road Fund is a partial owner of Aqua Power. So there's definitely synergy there, and the way you can deploy that supply chain and that know-how and that that financial capacity as a developer, to a wide geography is mutually beneficial, right? There's no issue there whatsoever. But I think what Mark is describing is really goes back also to Rod's comments in terms of state capacity. So it's great to see this, wonderful, buy-in in Lebanon and the use of distributed solar, rooftop solar. But the reason that happens is because the state was unable to service and provide electricity to its population. So it's about a failure. Jordan is a little different. We see, really, really good. I don't know. It's over 50% in terms of renewable power generation now in their energy mix, and that's great. But the region definitely struggles, and this isn't just the Middle East, in terms of the ability to have interconnectors and the buying and selling of power across national boundaries. And even within the GCC, this is a problem. We're just getting the build out of the GCC interconnector going to Oman, and this project has been in the works for decades. Kuwait buys a substantial amount of electricity from the UAE and Saudi Arabia through the GCC interconnector because they haven't been able to update their own gas-fired generation to install any really major solar capacity. They're working on it, but it's pretty marginal. And then, of course, to Iraq. I mean, that was always the intention, and the US government supported the idea of GCC interconnection to Iraq for power, to reduce dependency on Iranian gas. And it's just been years and years and years and not done well. So, whose fault is that? Well, it does take money to support these very large interconnectors and domestic grid systems. There's not a whole lot of incentive to do so, but that could be changing. So Syria is a great case and model what's happening right now. So you're seeing the commitment, particularly Saudi interest into the electricity sector, and Qatari interest in the electricity sector in Syria. And I think the difference now is that the motivation behind it is not just about selling power, or even political influence. It's about the confluence or the like shared ability to run power cables and data cables at the same time, right? So it creates an incentive to see more interconnection in all of these ways, that creates kind of new geographies, new conduits, and that is, I think, motivating a lot of the politics within the region. It has a lot to do with how the UAE and Saudi see Turkey. It has to see how they see their eastward connection into India and even to Pakistan. So this is perhaps the positive thing we'll see is more finance, more interest in strengthening domestic grids and their capacity to add more electricity. But they're going to want control, right? So it will certainly, I think, strengthen the foreign investor, the investor state, and national electricity companies.
Thank you so much, Karen. I do think an interesting topic for a further issue in this fantastically interesting series would in fact be the whole issue of data AI in the region. One of the great historic ironies of the current moment might surely be that the very highest end NVIDIA AI chips may meet Chinese solar in the Emirates in a way that they will not in the United States, which is truly one of the great historic ironies of our current moment. The only bad thing about this wonderful series of conversations is that they're short and they're sweet, and we're this morning in New York at the end of our allotted time. So I want to thank our wonderful panel for this really fascinating glimpse of the region and the energy issue. We couldn't have asked for a richer array of insights. And I look forward to seeing everyone again when, thanks to the initiative and energy of Amman and Istanbul Global Centers, we'll be convening another call just like this. Until then, all the best to everyone. Stay safe and see you soon.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.